Today we're going to be really delving into the fresh produce market inquiry of the Competition Commission. And what it means really for the people that we work with, for our work, for small scale farm workers, for small scale farmers, and others, SMMEs really. Before we get into, the program, the content, I would like to draw your attention to a few things, to a few housekeeping rules. One, it's not rules really, it's just things for you to note. One is that this session is being recorded and will be published on OZA's social media platforms. So we kindly request you to mute when you're not talking, mute your microphone. And as far as possible, please enable your video for the session. When you contribute to the conversation, please just unmute and talk. Of course, myself as the facilitator will have to call out your name first for you to be able to contribute. As far as possible, again, when you speak, please switch on your camera so that we can see you. And lastly, but most importantly, please introduce yourselves in the chat, because we will not have time, to register everyone in terms of everyone speaking and saying who they are. That is housekeeping. Again, thank you for joining us today. We are joined today by very important partners of ours, really, who do the work around just economies and how we create just and fair economies, really, for everyone to participate and everyone to benefit meaningfully from South Africa's economy. And the people joining us today to discuss this very important piece of research are Debuho, who's from CRED, Ruwan, who's from the Competition Commission, Busiswa Nyume and Livson Manguo from Oxfam, South Africa. We have Mamus Bongile, who's a farmer and an agent in the Joburg fresh produce market. We're also joined by Lihonolo, who is with the Grasa Machel Trust, and she's a programs officer there. They will speak to, the nuances and the details of their positions and the work that they do when they get an opportunity to speak. But just briefly, as Oxfam South Africa, we try to partner with marginalized people, with CSO partners, with partners in academia, in government, and everywhere, really to try and undo, patterns that perpetuate inequality and poverty, with a view of trying to create an economy that is fair and just, an economy where everyone can participate meaningfully. And in the work that we do, really, especially in engaging with small-scale farmers and other small business owners, we really come across challenges that sort of hinder people from participating in markets and in value chains in ways that improve their livelihood. And the very importance of this conversation today is that we are looking at an inquiry really that was conducted by the Competition Commission of South Africa, looking at the challenges in the fresh produce market, especially challenges as they relate to the experiences of farmers, especially Black, small-scale farmers and emerging farmers, really, to say how are they experiencing markets? What are the barriers, that hinder meaningful participation, and what are recommendations, really, that can improve people's participation in markets and in value chains? And to help us have this conversation, or to set us, on our way to have this conversation, Debu is going to speak really to the insights from the research and the experiences that they as CRED have had, engaging with the research, but also engaging with the people on the ground that are trying to enter markets. Is just going to really draw for us a picture and draw insights from the research that they found important and meaningful. After that, I'm going to hand over to Ruan to do really an overview of the fresh produce market inquiry, focusing on the barriers to entry and remedial actions that should be taken. Once we've had that conversation, we will then invite Hlohonolo to speak to the experiences that they have had at the GMT in terms of their work that empowers women in small and medium enterprises in their quest to partake in markets. And she's going to speak to those challenges and the experiences and tell us whether or not they feel this inquiry speaks to those challenges and addresses them. And finally, we will have Mamusbongile Cele, who is a farmer and an agent, and she's going to speak to her experiences as both those things and whether or not the inquiry is helpful, speaks to the challenges, and will also maybe add to say, these are the ways in which we strengthen the recommendations of the report. And then we'll open it up to questions from the room, really. Oh, before that, we'll have Usisibusiso Nyumeno, lives in Mango from OZA, just saying, what is the role of the movement that we as OZA and our partners in the Fair for All project are trying to put together? How do we respond to the challenges, but also how do we make use and hold those that empower accountable to the recommendations of the report? And then, of course, we'll open it up to conversations and questions, and then we'll talk about next steps. I'm going to hand over to Teboho now to give us his presentation, and then we kick off the program. Thank you so much, Teboho. Over to you.
Thank you, colleagues. Let me try to share my presentation. Can you all see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. Is it in presentation mode?
I think so.
All right.
No, it's a slide. No, it's a slide mode.
Put in slide mode.
I have on my side. I'm not sure why it's not showing on your side.
Teboho, I think you need to share the window of the slide. Maybe try that.
Let me see. How does it look now? So I've shared using the window.
Looks good on my side.
Is it fine on?
Bongani Lerato, please come in. But also I wanted to suggest, Teboho, maybe if it takes longer, you can just take us through your presentation and then share the presentation later so that it can be distributed.
You can also share it in the chat and I can share screen for you.
Okay, let me share it on the chat, and then you can share the screen for me. Yeah, it's shared. Please share from your side, Bongan.
I'm downloading it now, but you can begin and I'll start sharing once.
Sure. Maybe as you're trying to share. So I'm going to be sharing research, insights from the research that we've been conducting on the fresh produce market, particularly with the focus on the vegetable side of the fresh produce market, right? And this is the research that is part of the Fair for All project that we have been engaged in over a couple of years. And there are research reports that we have produced in that regard, particularly specifically produced by my colleagues who actually did the groundwork in terms of conducting interviews and conducting analysis as well. And those are Shingi Chisoro as well as Karisa Padiachi Mutu. So I'll just be sharing insights from that research in terms of the state of the fresh produce market, in particular the vegetable sector in South Africa, as well as the issues affecting participation of SMEs, also with linkages to women entrepreneurs as well. Next slide, please. So I'll just take you through a quick industry overview, and which is in terms of how the value chain is structured, production, as well as some of the key elements in terms of prices and some of the performance issues in terms of prices and production. So the value chain really starts at the production of inputs, which includes farming equipment, seeds, fertilizers, and agrochemicals, to then the production of vegetables or fresh produce by small, medium, and large vegetable growers, which then sell the produce to local markets in the form of informal buyers, local supermarkets, as well as corporate clients, right? We see that production of vegetables has grown over the period 2009 to 2021 as per our analysis, right? Production particularly increased by 30% from 4.3 million tons in 2007 to about 5.6 million tons in 2021. And the fastest growth was experienced between the 2007 to 2021 period in terms of carrots, which grew by 51%, followed by onions, which grew by 50%, potatoes by 37%, and beetroot by 32%. Green peas, green beans, and cauliflower have, however, been declining in production. There has also been declining in real prices of vegetables. For instance, by 17%, by 17% in that period. The largest decline has been in cabbages, in terms of prices, has been in cabbages, onions, and carrots, right? Whereas cauliflowers, beetroot, lettuce, and tomatoes recorded the largest growth in real prices in terms of the growth, in terms of the different segments of the vegetables, right? So those are just the dynamics and the broader overview in terms of production volumes, as well as the prices, as well as how the value chain looks like. Next slide, please. So I'll then get into some of the issues affecting the participation of SMEs. And I'll start at the level of the production, right? Wherein there is widespread entry and participation of small-scale farmers, However, that participation is typically dispersed and fragmented, and in most cases on favorable terms. There are two key issues that then affect women SME participation in that regard, and these are access to land as well as access to funding for inputs and on-farm infrastructure. In terms of access to land, this is largely accessed through private purchases of land, leasing of land from landowners, community property associations, municipalities, as well as government, right? Most smallholders do not have access to finance to purchase land, right? And in terms of the land reform program, the processes can be quite bureaucratic, which makes it difficult for SMEs to get access to land in that regard, right? In particular, women face cultural barriers to accessing and owning land, which has got implications on their ability to finance. And this is because of some of the cultural norms and practices that hinder women from getting title deeds, for instance, or where in some societies, women still need to be represented by men when they go and ask for access to land. And then in terms of inputs and production infrastructure, these are quite important to the production processes of vegetable farming, right? However, access to funding for those inputs and on-farm infrastructure is quite challenging and limited. And a brief background is that there have been rising prices of farming inputs, right? For instance, the prices of fertilizers more than doubled between the period 2020 and 2022. And these are typically absorbed by small-scale holder farmers, given that they are not price setters in the market. They are typically price takers, right? Because they don't have bargaining power to negotiate better prices with the markets, right? And some of the small-scale producers have tried to mitigate against this and try to implement measures to save input costs. For instance, by saving and banking seeds, right, to reproduce their own seedlings during the production processes, right? The vegetable farming itself is also very capital intensive and resource intensive, right? Because it requires investment in infrastructure, right? These are issues such as irrigation systems, boreholes and pumps, shade nets, greenhouse tunnels, fencing, farming tools, tractors, and so on and so forth. The issues of climate change also, in terms of the related risks such as strong winds, heavy rainfalls, frost, heat waves, demand that farmers invest in proper and adequate on-farm infrastructure. The greenhouse tunnels and shade nets, for instance, have become a necessity, given some protection that they are able to provide to the vegetables during the different seasons and during the different weather conditions. However, there's been a small scale holder farmers have experience in typically have inadequate infrastructure due to finance challenges, right? They largely get finance from government institutions and government departments. However, that funding that government funding tends to be limited in terms of scale and scope, right? But the other issue that farmers raise is that the application processes for government funding tend to be quite complex and cumbersome as well. Next slide, please. So that was a brief overview of the issues in relation to the production level of the value chain, right? There are also issues that are related to marketing, as I'll get into now, right? So fresh produce is largely sold through is largely sold through informal markets, local markets, fresh produce markets, as well as corporate clients, right? National fresh produce markets play an important role because they account for about 44% of fresh produce sales in the country. In terms of the dynamics as it pertains to entry and participation of SMEs, farmers typically have open access to the national fresh produce markets, and there are no supply agreements that are needed to use the market, right? Produce is typically sold through market agents, which farmers pay a commission to. However, farmers in these markets are not guaranteed a sale, right? Due to market supply and demand factors, right? Sometimes their produce does not get to be sold on the market due to oversupply. And in those instances, you find that their produce get discarded. It means that they lose quite a lot of money if their produce does not get sold. Because that's also because of the perishability of the vegetables, right? The dynamics in terms of prices is that prices tend to drop drastically and also influenced by supply and demand factors. For instance, the interviews with the small scale farmers indicate that prices, for instance, of spinach can drop by about 80 to 85% from as high as 15 rand to 20 rand a bunch of spinach to as low as 250 to 3 rand per bunch, right? Participation in this market and sustainability in this market is also influenced by good relationships with market agents, which are quite important for the success of farmers, right? And these relationships are often founded on the ability of farmers to provide consistent supply and high volumes, right? Agents tend to meet when the relationships are good. Agents tend to meet with farmers on a weekly basis to discuss statistics, to discuss what is needed at the market, and to discuss how the business is faring overall. However, although these relationships tend to be quite important, there are some issues that we raise in relation to those relationships, right? In that they may raise concerns about the neutrality and the fairness of the market dynamics at the national fresh produce market, right? And also they introduce an element of subjectivity and potentially create bias against new and unknown farmers that have not managed to establish those good relationships, right? And this, of course, could potentially raise issues of racial and gender biases, which may go unnoticed, right? Next slide, please. The other important routes to market are direct sales to the informal markets, right? And this channel accounts for about 42% of the national sales of vegetables to the consumers, right? This channel offers farmers higher prices compared to all the other markets, partly because they have relative bargaining power in setting prices because they sell to individuals and to households and that. So they have some level of bargaining power and therefore they can get better prices, right? These markets also allow farmers to capture most of the value because they can save on costs and fees related to agents and middlemen that are characterized, for instance, by the fresh produce markets, for example. However, there are challenges with this route to market in that the demand tend to be quite informal and unpredictable and erratic, right? Which makes these markets to be quite unreliable and unsustainable for the growth and expansion of vegetable farmers. The other important channel is the supermarkets channel, right? Actually, our research shows that small-scale farmers prefer to supply supermarkets because of consistency and reliability, right? Because they typically enter into contracts that gives them some security of supply over a period of time, right? However, supermarkets tend to prefer, on their side, large, relatively established and medium to large farmers who can adhere to high standards and requirements that are imposed by the supermarkets, right? In some instances, these standards go beyond the minimum standards legally required and go into some of the private standards that the supermarkets impose. And this has presented a significant challenge in terms of access to supermarkets, in terms of the ability of small-scale farmers to meet some of these standards. For instance, the food safety certification, the GAP, these are in addition to HACCP requirements that supermarkets impose, right? In addition to that, supermarkets often get regularly audited in terms of compliance with some of these standards, right? And they get audited at their own costs. In addition, supermarkets also have some degree of autonomy over trading terms in the form of promotion fees, payment terms, listing fees, as well as loading fees. All these requirements are quite challenging to meet by smallholder farmers due to the difficulties with access to finance that I've spoken about, right? And it is not the actual certification that tends to be expensive, but the underlying investments that are necessary to in order to get the certification. This includes investment into proper ablutions, investment in fungicides, herbicides, and pesticides that need to be stored also in a specified way according to the specifications of the markets, as well as harvesting and packaging requirements that also have to be made according to certain specifications of the markets. These investments into these activities tend to be quite expensive, and therefore make it quite difficult and challenging for small-scale holders to be able to comply with some of the requirements of the supermarkets, and therefore makes it quite challenging overall for the small-scale producers to be able to access supermarkets, even as is the preferred route to market compared to the other routes to market. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, in terms of some of the important takeaway points, it is that firstly, there is widespread participation of SMEs, particularly women-owned SMEs and women producers, right? However, they typically participate on unfavorable terms, right? Wherein there are challenges with access to finance for on-farm infrastructure, as I've spoken about, challenges with access to markets, whereby the national fresh produce markets, although being the major route to market, tend to be quite volatile and sustainable, while the informal markets as well offer better prices. The demand tends to be quite unpredictable. And with supermarkets, even though they are preferred because of their consistency and reliability, access there too tend to be quite challenging because of the cost of regulatory compliance that the smallholder farmers have to meet. That will be it from my side. I hope that captured in a nutshell the state of the fresh produce market in terms of vegetables in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teboho. Yes, that does an amazing work of giving us, people who are not working in that sector, a clear idea of the state of participation of small scale farmers and other small and medium enterprises in fresh produce markets, and really the challenges and the barriers that are faced by those who are trying to meaningfully participate there, and really just surfacing those challenges and things that might not be obvious, things like access to land and the cultural norms that hinder women in particular from participating meaningfully and getting funding for them to be able to to grow their produce and grow their crops and participate meaningfully. So thank you for that. Now going to hand over to Ruan to build on that conversation and speak to us, giving us the overview of the fresh produce market inquiry, and specifically with regards to the barriers to entry and proposed remedial actions from the Competition Commission. Over to you, Ruan.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. So yes, I think let's get right into the presentation we want to make. I think just one or two comments for sort of introductory comments. I think the first is that this is a huge report from the Commission. So, it spans the entire value chain in its printed format. It's over 400 pages. So it's a huge amount of work. There's a lot of information in this report. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really go high level. It's a real overview. I'm leaving out an enormous amount of detail, but I think the purpose of today is really just to provide that overview, to get that sort of introduction to what are the specific aspects from this inquiry that looked into fresh produce, that attaches to SMEs and HDPs in particular. And that is SMEs and HDPs across the value chain. So we're talking about small and emerging farmers. We're talking about market agents, small and black market agents. We're talking even about retailers. I think the second thing is, just to provide this context as well, is the difference between a market inquiry and some of the other work that the Commission does. Market inquiry is essentially a process very similar to, and some of you might know about the commissions of inquiry that the government launches from time to time. So ours is similar in the sense that it's an open process, it's open to the public, it's still guided by the rules of evidence and some formalism, but essentially it's not related to specific firms. So it's not a prosecution type, enforcement type investigation. So we're not looking at the conduct of specific firms to say, we think that you, firm XYZ, contravened the Competition Act, and this is an investigation against you. Instead, it's looking at a particular sector or a particular market as a whole and saying what in that entire market is problematic for competition purposes. And then there are different factors that we look at, but it's really non-firm specific. Obviously, during the course of the inquiry, you do deal with specific firms and specific conduct and that sort of thing, but it's not the immediate goal. The real goal is really to understand the market dynamics as a whole, and see what sort of structures, what features in that market is preventing competition. So in light of that is what I wanted to start off, I think also is the scope of the inquiry, of this particular inquiry. So in totality, the inquiry lasted about 21 months. We finished in January when we published our final report. But I think the starting point is, well, what did we look at? What did we consider? And we phrased it as themes. So essentially 3 themes that we considered. The first being the efficiency of the value chain is what we called it. And essentially that is how well do the NFPMs function. So the NFPMs are, of course, the municipal markets, the wholesale markets where farmers bring their produce, where market agents are active, and then where buyers attend those markets and sell their goods. Essentially, the efficiency relates to how well are they working. So in terms of their funding, their expenditures, their operations, in terms of how prices are determined, the relevant people that are involved in setting those prices, in monitoring those prices, in making those prices, essentially. So that was the first theme, very much focused on the municipal fresh produce markets, or NFPMs as we call them. The second theme was one level up in the value chain, where we wanted to understand the dynamics of key inputs. And Teboho mentioned some of the inputs. We focused on 3 inputs in particular, which was fertilizer, seeds, and agrochemicals. And essentially what we wanted to understand from those is what is the impact of those inputs, the impact that it has on farmers, but also on the rest of the value chain. And of course, we know, and we've known for a long time, that South Africa imports most of those 3 inputs, fertilizer, seeds, and agrochemicals. So we import the intellectual property, or we import the actual goods, or we import the components, and then we mix them ourselves here. But there's a lot of importing that happens in those inputs. And of course, that means that we are exposed to global events, and I think most recently, it's just things like the Ukraine war, things like COVID, those sort of things, have drastic impacts on pricing. And that is, of course, what we wanted to understand is exactly how does those sort of events impact the rest of the value chain. And then finally, what we wanted to look at, and that's particular for today, is the barriers to entry, particularly barriers to entry for small scale and emerging farmers. So very much a focus there on farmers. Under that theme, we had to select a number of barriers to entry, of course, and I think as Teboho also mentioned, there's quite a number of barriers here. We focused on things like market access. So how do small scale farmers access markets in terms of retailers, the supermarkets, in terms of the NFPMs, informal sector, those sort of market access questions. We looked at finance, we looked at water, and then we also looked at whether there's possible discrimination. So whether because they are small, they're being exploited when they buy their inputs or when they sell their produce. whether there are those sort of discrimination which is prohibited by our Act. Then those three themes were then essentially broken down further into a total of 19 very specific issues. And I'm not going to go through all of them now, but essentially it was what I mentioned, the things like how does the pricing of the inputs reflect? So if there's varying prices, how does that reflect? How does the unavailability of intellectual property, so some of the seeds that are bred internationally that's protected by plant breeders' rights, how does that affect access, those sort of things. So each of those were divided into 19 specific issues that we looked at. The next thing I just wanted to discuss, and Teboho also had a sort of industry value chain. I think ours is quite similar, but there's one point I wanted to make in our sort of simplified value chain. And this is, I think, critical for understanding the problems that this sector has, the problems that these value chain has, but also it speaks to the kind of remedies, the type of solutions that these value chains need. I think importantly, and this is not something that we had thought of in this sense before. So before this inquiry, our perspective had been that there's essentially a single value chain, and the single value chain is, from inputs to farmers to some type of wholesale and then down to retail. And whether that's informal or formal or in supermarkets, it's really all part of the same value chain. So what we discovered, and again, this is sort of a really evidence-based inquiry. This isn't just sort of us thinking about and researching this. This is us looking at actual evidence and then analyzing that evidence. Is what we concluded is that there are two distinct value chains. There's one value chain that takes the produce and moves it through the NFPMs, but then there's a second value chain that we called direct contracting. That is essentially the supermarkets contracting directly with the farmers and then moving the produce through their own distribution centers and then onto their retail stores. So they're distinct in the sense that they are separate, but there is, of course, interactions as you would expect. There are, of course, interactions between the two. And it's really more from the NFPMs exercising an influence over the retail, over the direct contracting than vice versa. Particularly what we found is that the retailers, when they negotiate the prices with the farmers, that the retailers actually benchmark their prices against the prices that are obtainable at the NFPMs. And that was very important for us because it means that there are options for farmers. It means that the retailers, unlike in other jurisdictions, particularly in the UK and the EU, have bargaining power. They're still in a good position where they can negotiate prices because they have options. If they don't get the price they want from the retailer, the price that the retailer offers them, they can take the very same produce and sell it through an NFPM. Yes, it's a bit different. They have to work through a market agent, but that option means that the NFPM and the pricing that occurs at the NFPMs is actually disciplining some of the pricing that happens in direct contracting. So what do these value chains look like? And I'm not going to go into detail here, but just so we're clear on this. So of course we have input suppliers at the top. Then we have the farmers or the producers. We have market agents. We have the NFPMs, and then we have the buyers and the distributors. You can, if you want, add another level there, which is essentially the consumers, but that's quite varied. So we stopped at sort of buyers or distributors. And then direct contracting looks very similar, particularly the input suppliers and then the farmers. But instead of market agents and the NFPMs, we have the supermarket distribution centers. So what happens here is that the supermarkets, when they contract directly with the farmer, the produce is harvested, goes directly from the harvest into usually a cold refrigerated truck, directly into the distribution center. And all of the retailers, the supermarkets, have these distribution centers. You see them when you drive next to the N1 here in Gauteng. You see a couple of them, but they're spread out across the entire country, really. So that produce gets taken directly to the distribution center. In fact, it gets packed and graded and sorted on the farm. It doesn't even arrive at the distribution center where it gets packaged and labeled and that sort of thing. All of that happens on the farm, which of course is a little bit different from the NFPMs because that's a lot more bulk, a lot more wholesale type sales that go on. And then from the supermarket distribution centers, the supermarkets themselves distribute with their own branded trucks they distribute to their individual retail stores across the country, and from there directly to the consumers. So I think the point here is simply to say that there are two distinct value chains here that we identified. It's not, as we had assumed at the start of the inquiry, and was our view, that it's all really part of the same value chain. And the distinction is important, as I said, and as we'll get there in a moment, about the type of problems and the type of remedies that we discovered in these value chains. So talking about the outcome, sort of jumping ahead and not going into too much detail regarding, the findings and the evidence and all of that, that's going to take forever. But jumping to the outcomes of the inquiry. So after we looked at all the problems and all the evidence, that 19 issues I mentioned at the start, is we identified a set of 31 remedies. So 31 solutions that we are proposing that spans the entire value chain. And there's a particular grouping to them, because I think it's always important to understand from the work that we do is that there's no silver bullet. There's no one remedy that fixes it all, particularly not in a value chain that's as complex and as dynamic as the fresh produce value chain. So our grouping is, there's essentially groupings per group of stakeholders, and those remedies as a whole seek to address the problems that we identified. So the first grouping is there for NFPMs, a range of remedies, about 5 remedies there that are targeted at the municipal fresh produce markets. Then we have the conduct of market agents. We have the structure of market agents. Then we have a remedy on the retail, the sort of pertains to price transparency. That's a sort of consumer welfare focused remedy that we have at the retail sector. We have a range of remedies on inputs, so the fertilizer, the chemicals, and the seeds, a range of inputs there, and then particularly remedy 26 to 31 for the barriers to entry. So just keep this grouping in mind. As I said, not all of these remedies pertain to SMEs and HTPs. I'm going to take you through some of the particular ones that pertain specifically to SMEs and HTPs. A lot of these remedies are focused on government, on DALRAD, on the other sector regulator for market agents, APAC, on some of the departments in DALRAD. There's remedies that talk to the Agricultural Research Council, Agricultural Inputs Control designate from DALRAD. So remedies aimed sort of at individual stakeholders, but as a whole, try to fix some of the problems we've seen. So some of the broad findings, I think, and this is where we're getting into the meat of what is relevant for SMEs and HTPs. So one of the broad findings is that NFPMs are in fact inefficient. So you'll remember that from the first themes, is that what we looked at is how well do these NFPMs function. Our finding is that NFPMs are in fact inefficient, meaning that they don't work as well as they should. And that pertains to, from the way that prices are set, to the way that they are run, to the way that they are maintained, sort of capital investments, they're not being upgraded, they're not being run properly, they're not as clean and clear and easy as they should be. Again, talking about, and we'll get to that in a second, the market agents, the conduct of market agents there are problematic. And that is, again, two related findings there, is that there are various practices that we identified, conduct by market agents, that affect prices, that are hugely problematic for us as the Commission, because they affect the way that prices are determined for the wholesale level of the value chain. So in particular, things like market agents using their own buyer cards, things like reserve buying, things like after hours trading. So all of those practices are things that happen across NFPMs and has an impact on pricing. So we're very concerned about those. And related to that is the extreme concentration levels of market agents. So what that simply means is that there are very few market agents with very large market shares. So you look at these markets individually, the biggest market in the country is Joburg, only has about 11 to 13 market agents that operate there. Of those, about 11, most of the market shares belong to the top 2 or 3 market agents. The rest are tiny, tiny market agents. They sort of live from hand to mouth. So huge market shares belonging to a very small number of people. And that's what we call high concentration. And that, of course, is bad from a competition perspective, because you want the more firms, the better the competition. The more competition there is, usually the lower the prices. And when we talk about prices here, We're talking both about the prices of the produce, but also the prices for their services, because these market agents render a service, and you want them to be competing against each other, not only in setting the best price for the buyer and for the farmer, but also in competing with each other. So extreme concentration levels, and that of course is very particular for SMEs and HTPs. For HTPs, SME farmers, it means it's very difficult for them to sell their goods at the NFPMs, in the sense that if you don't have a relationship with a market agent, you're not going to get the attention, you're not going to get the negotiation, you're not going to get the pricing at the end of the day that you would want. They sort of just brush you aside because they're dealing with the large farmers, they're dealing with the other large agents. So there's that sort of barrier to farmers, but also to small and black agents at these markets. It means it's difficult for them to operate at these NFPMs because most of the produce belongs and goes through the hands of the large market agents. And anyone that understands this market, that has been there, knows we're talking about the RSA group, we're talking about Subtropico, we're talking about the Grow group, and then there's another of individual firms that have fairly large market shares, depending on which market and which produce you look. So problems around the market agents, quite a lot of problems there. Then also what we found, and this is a very sort of high-level finding, is that the competition at the formal retail levels, meaning the supermarkets, is ineffective. And I think this is hugely important from a consumer welfare perspective, because what we find as consumers, and we all consumers as we sit here as well, we all buy our fresh produce as well, most of us from supermarkets, is that competition is actually ineffective. And it feels counterintuitive for a moment, because you look at those refrigerated trucks, you drive past those huge distribution centers, you walk into a store, and it all feels very sophisticated. It all feels very expensive. And you think, how can this be inefficient? But what we mean is that these retailers aren't able to pass on the produce that they buy from the farmers to the consumer without adding a huge amount of costs. And that's what we refer to as when we say that their supply chain, that second direct contracting value chain that I mentioned at the start, is a very expensive supply chain. The type of technology, the type of logistics that go into the supermarkets bringing the fresh produce from the farm into your retail stores is massive. We're talking a very, very, very expensive supply chain. Yes, it's sophisticated. Yes, it's state of the art, but it comes at a massive cost. And the question is immediately is who's paying for that? Because it's not them. They are recouping their cost from you and I as the consumers. And that's what we say when we say it's ineffective competition. Of course, what we also mean is that when you look at the competition between the supermarkets, it seems that they are very comfortable. Of course, they would tell you that they are competing vigorously and there's a lot of innovation, but that's not really what you see. If you take a step back, what we did as the regulator, when you take a step back and you look at pricing dynamics and you look at things like innovation, you don't really find that. You get the sense that these supermarkets are really just very comfortable. They're not making a dent, and they're not making a dent because of competition. They're making a dent when Checkers is growing their market shares. It's really Pick n Pay, for example, is making errors in the way that they do their business financing and that sort of thing. They get themselves into trouble with their shareholders, with their share pricing, and that affects their ability to open new stores, and then Checkers comes in. It's not really then because the pricing that Checkers offers is better than the pricing that Pick n Pay, for example, offers, and for that reason, Pick n Pay is losing market shares. No, it's for different reasons. And that's what we're saying is lacking. We want these retailers to be competing on pricing because that's good for the consumer. Right, so then moving back to imports again is, I mentioned this at the start, we confirmed it. And I think what we also confirmed is just how incredibly complex and difficult it will be to solve the input problems. So we are incredibly vulnerable because of our exposure to imports. So because we don't have a lot of local manufacturing ability, for example, in fertilizer, yes, we mix the fertilizer, but we really don't produce a lot of fertilizer in this country. We don't have the sort of research capacity anymore to be developing our own breeds of different types of fruit or vegetables. It's all sort of international intellectual property that we import and then adapt through firms that operate in this country. And similar with chemicals. Chemicals really is more like fertilizer, that we really just import the final product, or we import them bulk and we mix a little bit, but we don't manufacture those chemicals in South Africa. The raw ingredients doesn't come here. And that means we are exposed, and that means there will always be an impact on farmers. And farmers, of course, feel it the most directly. The moment there's a price shock or there's a global thing that happens, even now the trade wars that is sort of kicking off with the US and their aggressive sort of trade wars, that even might have an impact eventually when it comes to agricultural products. We will likely feel that impact as well. And then, of course, there are distinct barriers to entry for SMEs and farmers. Again, we confirmed those, and when we looked at market access, problems with market access. It's difficult for farmers in particular to access some of the markets. It's difficult for them to access finance. There's problems with water, in accessing water licensing, in sort of qualifying for water licensing. So we confirmed those. So when we move on to the remedies, and this is sort of, what are the solutions we found? Again, this is very high level. The first is there are a number of interventions, a number of remedies that seek to improve the efficiencies at the NFPMs, particularly around increasing the sales by SME and HDP farmers. So again, this is where the Department of Agriculture, the market authorities, the market agents, every single role player that has a role to play at the NFPMs, we're imposing certain remedies on them and certain recommendations on them to make these NFPMs more efficient. And it goes from about changing their business model in that they're no longer sort of just part of the municipal system, that it actually becomes an SOC or a public-private partnership, down to the ring fencing of profits, so that they can reinvest those profits into upgrading their facilities, expanding their facilities, that sort of thing. Down to obligations to say, well, you have to educate farmers, you have to educate market agents, you have to bring in more players at your facilities. So those are the sort of interventions that are really directly aimed at bringing in more sales from SME and HDP farmers. We know the big farmers, they're very happy to continue doing business. They do business both in direct sales and in the NFPMs. And they're not really going to change anything there unless, there's a natural disaster or something like that, and the volume drops, or seasonality, or that sort of thing. But there's no more large farmers to bring into the fold. You have to bring in SMEs and HDP farmers if you want to increase sales at NFPMs. I think also there's a number of interventions addressed at market agent practices. And it really stems from this understanding that market agents are a sort of gatekeeper when it comes to selling fresh produce at the municipal fresh produce markets. They are the specialists when it comes to understanding prices, when it comes to understanding volume, seasonality, all those factors. And they are, as I mentioned earlier, all of their practices that we have a problem with impact on the pricing, impact on the access SME and HDP farmers. So a range of remedies that seek to address those practices, particularly working with the sector regulator for market agents called APAC to address some of those interventions and some of those practices. Also, when we talk about shareholding, about decreasing some of that concentration, breaking up some of the big firms at their shareholding level to try and sort of deconcentrate there a little bit more. Also, another set of remedies talk to DALRRAD in particular. Something we found is that really just a lack of coordination when it comes to Department of Agriculture. It's not that they're assisting, it's just that they're assisting quite haphazardly and quite all over the place. We need better coordination. One of the things is that you have to stop for a moment, take all your assistants and all the different departments and divisions and units and sort of come up with a single plan that assists everybody and not just sort of one by one. And I think that's quite important here, is that DALRRAD has such a critical role to play when it comes to addressing some of the problems, and yet they're also quite scattered in their approach. So we want them to sort of give attention to that. Also, there are remedies aimed at stimulating entry by SMEs at a retail level. So this is sort of the green grocer model. Talks about what I said earlier about the supermarkets being very comfortable in the way that they compete, that what you actually want them is new entry, because the competition isn't going to come from each other. It's really going to come from new entry. So the green grocer model, that we want SMEs and HDP green grocers that are only selling fresh produce to enter into supermarkets and then compete on fresh produce, where they get their supply from the fresh produce markets, where they don't have this massively expensive supply chain that they have to recoup from the consumers. And from the consumer's perspective, you can walk into a supermarket, into a mall, or whatever sort of strip mall, and then go buy your fresh produce, and then walk across and buy the rest of your groceries. So that's the sort of model that we envisage, and that's what we think can stimulate, especially pricing behavior amongst the retailers. And then also we have some very specific remedies. So the first 4 on your screen is very much sort of broader remedies and groupings of remedies that, if put together, try and resolve some of the issues. But there's also very specific remedies aimed at a very particular problem, aimed at very particular firms. So, for example, supply development programs for seed suppliers. So the 2 largest seed suppliers in South Africa have, for the next 3 years, have to develop supply development programs, reaching about 700 farmers. 60% of those have to be black farmers, where when they test their produce, when they test their seeds, that they use small and black farmers. Also, donations or money that they have to make, contributions they have to make to development funds, skills transfer. So, how to plant, what is the best circumstances, the best soils, that sort of thing that these seed companies agree to when it comes to getting more farmers, essentially small and black farmers. Then also access to seed intellectual property. So this is particular to Simba. So they developed their own seed, potato seed varieties. There's one that had expired, but they removed it from circulation. So we agreed with them that they would bring it back into circulation. They would essentially donate the previous variety to the Agricultural Research Council, and then it's available to anyone that wants to, because it's a tried and tested variety, particularly obviously for crisp or potato chip manufacturing, that farmers that want to enter there, that want to supply into that value chain, now has access to a variety that is free from intellectual property. And the problem, of course, was even though it was free, the actual plant material, the genetic material, wasn't available to them because that was situated in the gene bank in the United States. So Simba has agreed to import that variety, and they've already started that process. Our variety is currently in quarantine. Once that's done, it will be given to the Agricultural Research Council for further cultivation, and then it's available to any farmer that wants access to that. Then also particular interventions into the blended finance scheme. We confirm that is really the best sort of approach when it comes to lack of financing for small farmers. That the blended finance scheme is the way to go, we believe. We here had interventions for the commercial farmers, for the land bank, and then of course the delays were at the Department of Agriculture. So that's really the commercial banks are saying we are absolutely ready and to go with the blended finance schemes, but the holdup is with the department. So really here trying to get the department to come to the table and get this blended finance schemes implemented. Then a remedy on retail price transparency. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And then skills transfer. So particularly for market agents, things like management agreements where a large agency for a period of 2 years goes into an agreement with a smaller or a black agency and then transfers some of the business skills. So the skills that you need to understand how to run a business, things like accounting, things like marketing, like planning, budgeting, contracting, procurement, supply chains, those sort of business related skills that the large market agents have to transfer to the small and black agencies operating across the country. And again, that's something to stimulate new entry and growth from those small agencies. And then finally, the other observations that we make, and I'm going to close with this, is observations, again, sort of, taking that step back, one step back, looking at it from the outside, and some of the other interventions that I think is important for context purposes is when we talk about the problems facing fresh produce, when we talk about problems facing agriculture, in fact, I think these are some of the observations that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that we found that the municipal fresh produce markets are absolutely critical infrastructure, critical for food safety, for food security, and for competition. So there's this belief that it's an outdated model, that it's an unsophisticated model, that we should do away with this, as it happened in most of the world. In fact, we're saying no, don't do away with this wholesale model. This commission-based wholesale model. In fact, you have to rebuild them, you have to establish them, you have to strengthen them so that they actually perform better and better. They are absolutely critical. We also found that South Africa is the only fully based commission market system in the world. So there are other sort of wholesale big market, wet markets and that sort of thing in Asian countries that you find. None of them operate on a commission-based system. So it's sort of really just a wholesale business where it's product just moving through bulk through these markets. This is separate. This is a commission-based system where prices get negotiated and then based on a commission system is moved through that market. And that's to our benefit. It's to our benefit, and we saw this in COVID-19, for example, where there was no shortage of essential foods because fresh produce, in essence, because these markets were operating. Within a week of the lockdown, these markets reopened, and then food was moving through to the poorest of the poor. And that is to our benefit. It's why we're saying don't close them down. In fact, strengthen them, make them function better, expand them, have them grow. Another important factor is what we found is that there is, in fact, no buyer power where the retailers exercise that on the farmers. Very concerned about this when we started the inquiry. We thought the supermarkets were going to be big, they're large, that they tell the farmer that this is the price you get. I don't care about what you can afford or what your cost is. This is the price I'm offering you, and you have to take that farmer. On the contrary, we found that the farmers, in fact, have a lot of bargaining power. They are able to negotiate with the retailers effectively. Related to this, what we also found is that the retailers, in most cases, actually offer beneficial terms and conditions to your SMEs and HDP. So they get better things like better payment terms, lower rebates, quicker repayment terms than the large farmers. So there really is no problems from the retailers. I think, unlike in the European Union and the UK in particular, is we don't have that in South Africa. And that's another finding of the Commission where we said that has to remain. For as long as that remains, we're not going to have a problem with buyer power. And then also what we found interestingly is that the farmers tend to get higher prices from the retailers than they get from the NFPMs. Again, here we thought the retailers might be exploiting farmers. That is not the case. The farmers actually get higher prices from the retailers than they do from the NFPMs. And then, as I mentioned, that the retailers are in fact inefficient despite their highly advanced distribution center. And then again, as I also said, the retail space needs more competition, the green grocer model. So I think those are the observations that we want to leave with you, that we want to frame the debate, frame the context when we talk about how to solve the barriers to entry for SME and HDP farmers in particular, but really SME and HDP stakeholders across the value chain. Right, so that's it from me, Mandisa, and happy to take questions on your queue. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was helpful so much. Thank you for taking us through the report, the inquiry, and the report, really just the scope of the report, your findings, which spoke to the inefficiencies of the NFPMs, the problematic conduct of market agents, extreme concentration of agents, exposure to global events with regards to farming inputs, and really just the experiences and barriers to entry for SMEs and historically disadvantaged persons. And of course, then the sort of suggestions and ideas towards how we begin to resolve those problems. This is very helpful. We appreciate your contribution. Livson, I see your hand is up. I am just wanting to bring in Nolo and Sibongile, and then we open for questions, if that is okay, comrades. So that we just get all the contributions and then we can open up and have a conversation. In that spirit, Nihlogonolo, you are part of an organization that is really trying to facilitate meaningful participation of small and medium enterprises, as well as, you know, women and Black women, to be particular, in Africa. I wonder what your reflections are, you know, in terms of the findings of the report, in terms of the experiences, from your work on the ground as someone who's really trying to facilitate economic and social advancement of women, especially with regards to business and participation in value chains. Just your reflections and your experiences from the work that you do. You know, what are you feeling? What are you hearing? And, you know, what are your reflections on the conversation? Please go ahead and speak to us about your work and your reflections on the report and the findings thereof.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mandisa, and good morning to everyone, to my fellow panelists. So my name is Letronolo, as I've been introduced, Ratlabiana. I am a program officer at the Graça Machel Trust. I will try to be as brief as I can be, and also just to share my reflections. But just before I start, I am from the Graça Machel Trust, and we are a Pan-African organization that is really committed to advancing women's economic empowerment. And I'm the program lead under the Fit for All project. And we have been working particularly with women-owned SMMEs in Gauteng, in the Eastern Cape mostly, and the Western Cape, and working around you know, the wine value chain, citrus, poultry, and women who are also mostly in the Eastern Cape that are within the fresh produce. I think looking at the work that we have done, particularly working with women-owned SMMEs, and we've been able to you know, really in engagement with women, we've been able to see really the challenges. And I think, you know, that has highlighted even in the presentation is what we are seeing as, you know, the lack of land access and capital, where women really struggle to secure you know, funding and land due to some of the cultural norms and rigid financial systems. But we're also seeing that when it comes to really, you know, access to market, there's a lack of market linkages between women-owned SMMEs, you know, connecting them with buyers and making it hard for them to really secure you know, the markets, also because they are struggling with, like, you know, having, you know, scales of produce because of the issue of land, and then also seeing the bureaucratic processes and barriers that continue to hinder women in terms of really making even in the value chain, and this, you know, we've seen in the research that we've done, the complicated certification processes and compliance requirements, particularly that are preventing women from entering into the formal markets. But we also see, you know, infrastructure, technology gaps, you know, the poor transport, lack of storage facilities, as you know, it has been mentioned already in the conversation. And what we've seen, especially in the Eastern Cape, where women are really mostly centered in the you know, rural areas where there's limited technology, and it makes it, you know, difficult for them to compete much more better in the industry. So those are some of the issues that we found. But not just, I just don't want to just focus on the challenges, but I think there's also like good work that women are doing, to try and succeed in the industry. And we've also put in interventions in terms of providing them with, capacity building, sessions, and also helping them to access markets where we help them to get into exhibitions, supporting them, and also doing a lot of advocacy work on policy, and also taking women into, advocacy spaces where they can be able to share more in terms of what the work they are doing. So in terms of the report, where do we see alignment, from our perspective, as much as the report does really identify structural issues in the fresh produce market, and recognizing that it really does affect small and historically disadvantaged farmers, but there are a lot of recommendations that I think we do align with, although there's still gaps. I mean, especially because we are an advocacy organization, and our really our focus is really seeing a gender transformation within the agricultural value chains. As much as we see in terms of the alignment, we think this is a great step in terms of barriers to market entry and participation. And the report suggests that the national fresh produce market should increase purchases of SMMEs and historically disadvantaged farmers by 10% annually. We do think that this is a great step, but there's still those barriers that women are facing, especially within the traditional rules and traditional authority rules, and we're seeing lack of a bit of disadvantage for women in accessing land within rural areas. There's also lack of business networks that women don't necessarily find themselves in. So we do think that a gender-focused intervention is really what women need to ensure that they aren't left out. And also where we see alignment and from the recommendations is that, the report proposes reinvesting the NFMPM profits into better storage and trading facilities, which we think is really crucial. But we also want to see, it being explicitly addressing the financial exclusion of women, because we do understand that when we look at finance and credit, women are always regarded as, high risk. So how do we ensure that products are tailored in a way that is include alignment in a sense that in terms of access to markets and business networks, the FPMI is calling for better price transparency and municipal reforms, more stronger business networks amongst women, and mentorship programs to ensure that there's full participation within the sector. And lastly, when we look at regulatory and compliance barriers, how do we ensure that the recommendation in terms of reducing unfair market agents practices and capping commission, which is positive, but we also need to figure out ways in which we can simplify the certification to ensure that there's access, especially to export markets. So I think I'll pause there in case there are any questions. But yeah, I think this way we see really alignment in terms of the report and the work that we are doing as the trust. Thank you. Thank you, Mandisa.
Thank you so much, Nolo. Thank you for those reflections. I want to pose questions for now. You're raising very important points that I'm hoping that we explore further in the Q&A session. But I want to bring in Sisibongile. Sisibongile, you are a small-scale farmer yourself, a Black woman at it. And you've had your own challenges in terms of accessing markets and meaningful participation in the markets. But you're also an agent with the Joburg fresh produce market, right? I would like to just get your reflections, of course, based on your experiences and the work that you've done to, challenge and deal with barriers to entry for yourself as a Black woman, but also your experiences as an agent of the fresh produce market as well. Just your reflections with regards to the report and the presentation, and what your thinking is at right now.
Good morning, fellow farmers and also industry colleagues. I'm really excited. My name is Bongile Makulucele, a farmer, an accountant. I retired at Deloitte to do farming. When I turned 50, I started doing farming. We are the first group that started the rooftop farming in the inner city of Johannesburg. And as a farmer, the challenges that we faced were exactly what has been raised in the inquiry. And I'm really excited that an inquiry was done to assist us to look at challenges and also coming up with solutions. And as a farmer, being through the challenges that we faced as farmers and which we still face, which are still not fully addressed, I looked at market access and started a company called Green Tree Agency, where we're doing agency facility for farmers to say, as farmers, for access to market, we are here to actually receive your produce, work with you. And the strategy that we're using is actually collaboration, where we looked at how do we collaborate with farmers to actually look at how do we address these challenges that were raised even in the inquiry, where there's fewer Black agencies in the Joburg market. We actually the first woman-owned Black agency at the Joburg market. And part of the transformation agenda was to say, can we look at how we also bring everyone on board, especially as farmers, because as a farmer, I know the challenges that I faced when I was bringing my produce to the Joburg fresh produce market. And as we look at going forward and being the solution, we are looking at capacity building and also addressing financial exclusion of women in the economy of South Africa. So we are addressing those issues by saying, as women, we need to be procuring from each other as well, and also looking at way of addressing the issue of compliance that has been raised as a challenge at the Joburg fresh produce market. And we've made plans to actually look at how do we bring in women farmers to be given an opportunity to be trained and workshopped on how to be compliant to supply the fresh produce market. And there's an upcoming event that we're doing on the 24th of March as a solution to that challenge that we face. And then on the pricing as well, because we're also looking at pricing, because as a farmer, I had challenges where my pricing for produce included the input costs, which was a high cost, the labor cost, which is built into the price that I have to now be selling to the agency too. So we're also looking at how do we now look at pricing as a sustainable price, because if you say to a producer, produce for me lettuce, and you are willing to procure from them, but the pricing, it's a challenge from an agency point of view and also to the retailers, because as agencies, we are linked to retailers as well who are buyers. So we're looking at saying, can the price be fair and sustainable to the producer as well, because he's the one incurring all the costs from inception. And the cost challenges have always been like the regulation that is regulating the pricing at the fresh produce market. It's a serious challenge because now you find yourself as a farmer, you incur the cost. I'll take like an example that I was citing of a lettuce. Your lettuce, you produce it at 4 rand, but you're expected to sell it at the Joburg market at 1 rand. And now it means you're not producing, you're actually discarding the produce. So we're looking at transparency of pricing and also giving a pricing that not only squeezes the producer, but the end consumer, which is a household that's going to be procuring this produce from farmer to the retail shops where the distribution is done. So these are the issues that our strategy, the approach as Green Tree is that we should actually be looking at offtake agreements as well with producers, and also negotiation of price. And the price, it needs to be sustainable for the producer and also for the consumer. And citing what has just happened yesterday, where on the 12th, there's been an increase on VAT, and it also going to affect us as farmers, also as the end user, which is the household that's going to need to buy produce and be using that as the end user. So those are other factors that we need to look at to say that 1%, it affects everyone across the board, because for a producer, you need to go and get inputs, and the inputs are expensive. And still on inputs, because when I was listening to the competitions board inquiry, was also on the seeds. And as a seed custodian myself, I need to look at how do we now make sure that our seeds are not as expensive, because for a farmer to do production, if the seed is expensive, it causes a problem. And we're also looking at how do we make sure that the seeds are not too expensive for farmers, and also how do we change the way we do our production, because we're looking at the expensive cost of pesticides, the expensive cost of production inputs, which now when you look at it, there's also that issue of are they not hazardous for producers, because also for households, because if you look at some of the products that are used to produce, one, they're imported from other countries, and the challenge is also most of them, they're poisonous, and there's been cases that were raised to say some of the input that is being used, especially pesticides, it's damaging a whole lot of people. So we're also looking at changing the food system, not only just as an agency, but as a farmer that started growing food organically, and to make sure that we don't use inputs on the pesticides on our produce, and that's the differentiator that we are bringing in as Green Tree, to say we're looking at producing food that is safe for our people, and also the safety even at the market, because I've done this research for a year. It took me a year to be into this Joburg market. And I did a lot of research where we were also looking at the state of the market. And also we're looking at food and safety challenges that we are seeing here at the market, because when you look at the systems that are used, they haven't been improved, and the cleanliness is also an issue. And the other thing that was not raised in the market inquiry was the food waste. So we're looking at the food waste. How do we address the food waste that is happening here at the Joburg market? Because on Mondays, when you come in, there's lots of food that is being thrown away. And some of it not in a good state. It's given to our crèches, schools, and hospices. So we're looking at, say, how do we now look at the solution? So there's proposals that I've sent to the Joburg market to say, can we set up a freeze-dry center where we can freeze-dry the produce and save it? Because if you look at food security, if we still have food that is being thrown away when it can be salvaged before it's thrown away, and then it's freeze-dried and put into a powder form so that it reaches the other people who are coming in to say, we need to be given food, but the challenge is that we cannot afford the food because of the cost of living. So those are the things that we've been looking at, and I'm really excited with the partnerships that are coming in from the organizations like Oxfam and Gresham National Trust, where you're saying let's look at how we do inclusivity of women into the industry as well. And I'm looking forward to these long-term relationships as we build the nation and addressing the economic situation in this nation of South Africa. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sis Bongile. for your reflections and really your suggestions in terms of the work that you've begun to do. I'm going to open for questions right now. And I know, Mongo, your hand was up and there was someone else who had their hand up. But before I give it to you, I'll maybe use my advantage, or Nazar, I see you. I wanted to use the advantage of being a coordinator of sorts and ask my question first, and maybe to you, Ruwan, but anyone really. So inquiries don't happen in a vacuum, right? They happen because there's a suspicion of a problem that exists there. And in your opening remarks, you spoke to, when you were speaking to the scope of your inquiry, you spoke to it not being, a thing that you can really enforce in a way. Oh, I'm paraphrasing, and please correct me if I'm paraphrasing it wrong. But my question is exactly with regards to that, and having experienced other commissions of inquiry and really activists like ourselves having to go to court to get the recommendations of a certain commission to be implemented. What avenues exist for small scale farmers, for SMEs, for HDPs really, that will help ensure that the recommendations that we have put forward are enforceable and can be implemented? What is it that people like ourselves who work with small scale farmers or small scale farmers themselves and other small business owners, what is it that can be done so that this inquiry and its findings is not just sitting there collecting dust, but it's an active document, right? That helps improve the experiences of small business owners in the fresh produce market. I'm going to put that question there, and you don't have to respond to it now. We will take 3 more hands, and then you can respond, and then I will take another round of hands. That will probably bring us to a close. So I'm going to take Livsin, I'm going to take Rinat and Nazir for now. Oscar and Pastor Lebu, I see you, but I will take you in the next round. Livsin, Rinat, Nazir, in that order, and then we take answers.
And thanks to the colleagues that have been presenting. I think this is really eye-opening to find a lot of us. We are not experts in these areas of work, but we appreciate your insight and your valuable assessment of the situation and how we can improve the lives.
Sorry, Levson, we can't hear you from our side. Can you increase the volume?
Can you hear me now?
It's a bit better, yes. Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. So I think I just wanted to comment and also raise the question in my submission. I think I just wanted to appreciate the insight and the knowledge and the information that was shared with us and our stakeholders. I think it's valuable, and we need to more of these engagements to sustain that. My question is really around small scale farmers, specifically those that want to start following. I mean, looking at the challenges that you have raised, I think they apply to conventional farming. People that are using conventional farming and maybe producing at scale as well to be able to sustain themselves and access this market. There's small scale farmers that are moving towards planting seeds and producing at the local level. Is there space for small scale farmers doing agroecology in the market? The NSCM, the farmers. That's my first question. Maybe the second one is really around, we talked about green shop for green market. Is there any benefit in terms of starting local fresh produce, centers that take from producers locally and put the produce on their market, and then they are sold in community. The reason why I'm asking is that one of the projects we have been engaged in includes producing food and schools and these community centers where that are accessible to communities, and whether these can be an alternative in terms of fresh produce and getting it straight to the market without having to incur costs such as taking it to the fresh produce market or supermarket. And you have these locally, local communities that have local economies where food is produced and consumed within the industry. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Livsin. Nazar, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. I wonder if you can hear me. Can you see me? Okay, good. Yeah, so I want more, kind of understand more on the inquiry about a couple of things. So the one thing, there are three things I want to have more clarity on, which was raised in the inquiry. So these are that it's alarming that SMEs producers have to kind of develop good relationships with the market agents in order to have their produce sold, and which is quite alarming. Which means that the large buyers, large farmers, have more leverage, have more power over the agents. And then also I noticed that the inquiry noted that the supermarkets also have a large influence on market agents and the price, right? So I wanted to ask three questions related to that. So the one question I have is, how did the inquiry, how do they understand how the market agents impact on the price of the fresh produce sold, and then how does the retail chains impact on the price, and then finally, how can the price for small farmers how can small farmers have a price that really benefits them? Because the price in the market fluctuates up and down depending on supply and demand, but also depending on other factors, including influence of retailers and market agents. Has the inquiry looked at how small farmers can have a better price at the market? So those are the three questions I have. Thanks for now. I have more, but later on.
Thanks, Nazir. Rina, please go ahead, and then we can have replies.
Thanks everybody, and good morning, everyone. I'm Rina from CRED. Thank you very much to all the presenters, as well as the inputs that came in from actual market participants. I think that really brings these issues back to the ground, because these are the concerns that participants are facing. So I just wanted to ask a set of questions around the recourse that farmers have now that the inquiry findings are out. So I guess it draws on what Mandisa has asked, as well as what Nolo reflected on. And I suppose I'll be asking this to Ruan. So a lot of the remedies require engagement with other government departments, for example, development finance institutions. I wondered if you could share, Ruan, what the Commission is doing with regards to, kind of updating these other government departments on the findings so that they can start with the implementation of some of these recommendations. And that goes to Mandisa's question or comment on what happens now that we can operationalize some of the remedies and that the report doesn't just sit on the shelf gathering dust. So I wanted to understand what the Commission is doing in terms of engagements with other government departments to operationalize some of the remedies. And then the second point, and it's also related, you talked about the blended finance scheme, which is really, really interesting. And you did mention some of the delays there. And I just wanted to also find out, and I think a lot of the audience here would also be interested in, is the blended finance scheme on favorable terms? Because often when commercial banks are involved, you get sort of commercial terms that are not favorable for small businesses. So just some of your reflections on that, and importantly, where to from now in terms of the remedies. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. I'm just stepping on behalf of Mandy Session, just stepped out a bit. So I'm just going to open to go for one and Nolo and even Tongile to respond to the three questions that have just come up. Then we can take
Levison, we're
I
struggling
think
to
we're
hear
struggling to hear you. Oh, I was going to ask if you can switch off the video. Maybe we can hear you. Levison.
Can you hear me now?
It's a bit better, Levson.
Okay. So I'm just taking over from Mandy for a bit.
Levison, if you can raise your voice because we're struggling to hear you, and you've got questions that you want us to answer, and we can't hear the questions. Just raise your voice.
I'm using my tablet, so I'm not so sure if it is a problem.
Yeah, speak like we are at the stadium. We are allowed today because of the challenge with the sound.
Can you hear me now?
It's getting better, Levson.
All right. I'm saying I'm just taking over from Mandisa and opening it up to the panel to present their to respond to the questions that have been asked. I think the first question that I was asking about the role of farmers practicing agroecology, how they can enter these markets, considering that these markets are already designed for conventional farming. And I think Nazir had a couple of questions, around the advantages of big farmers vis-a-vis small scale farmers entering the markets. And then the last question was really around how to get government departments to get involved in implementing the recommendations and the issue of blended finance and whether it's really favorable for small scale farmers. So I'm just opening it up, and Nolo, Luan, I think, and Tebofo, and even Sispongile, if you feel you are able to respond to the question, please go ahead, and then I'll take another round of questions.
Sure. Thanks, Listen. Let me start with the questions directed at me, and then, of course, the other panelists can come in. I'd like to get their views as well. I think it could be interesting. So the first question was Mandisa, and I think it links to what Rina also asked, is sort of how does the Commission enforce? What is the powers that the Commission has to prevent this sort of just becoming another Commission report that, or Commission of Inquiry type report that sits on a bookcase and gathers dust? And I think for that is we have powers in terms of the Competition Act that sort of gives two avenues of, in brackets, enforcement. And the first one is the sort of more direct approach. That is when it comes to remedies aimed at private firms. When the Commission, in terms of this report, makes a remedy against a particular firm in the private sector, those remedies are binding. So that private firm, that company, doesn't have an option. It's like a court order. It doesn't have an option to say, I'm just going to ignore this. This isn't for me. Look the other way and walk away. So the Commission has powers to enforce that in the competition tribunal. It's a court process if there is non-compliance. So a lot of the remedies of the 31, there's a bunch of them that are aimed directly at private firms, particularly in this context against market agents, where if they want to ignore, if they want to walk away, they can't do that. So because the findings that we make, the remedies we make are binding on them. It's not a question where they can just ignore it and walk away. If they do ignore that, the Commission can enforce that through competition tribunal proceedings, sort of enforcement proceedings in the competition tribunal. And we're very conscious of that approach. I think when we spoke to those firms, when we imposed these remedies, we had discussions, we had conversations with those firms. So it's not a situation where this is a one-sided approach from us to say, you know, we are forcing you into this box. Of course, a lot of the times the private firms will say more regulation. I don't like this. Leave me alone. We had those conversations with them before we published our report to say, okay, so this is what we are going to ask you to do. Can you do it? If not, why not? What is the best? So when we ended up with the remedies, it was with the understanding from those firms that this is what's going to happen. Thus far, and it's been about 2 months now, thus far, none of the private firms that are bound by these remedies have said, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to lodge an appeal against the findings. We're going to go to court and fight this out. Not a single one has done that. So we're on a path already of compliance, a path where they are saying, okay, within the time frames that the Commission has given us, we are going to comply. And in any event, their timing for lodging appeals have run out. And they haven't lodged any appeals. There's no appeals against the findings at this point. So I think that's the first point to remember, is that when we talk about private firms, these are binding remedies. They can't walk away. Thus far, none of them have tried to walk away. Linked to that is the Commission's own powers of monitoring and enforcement. So the report itself and even the Competition Act gives us certain powers to remain with these inquiry even after it's done, and particularly for monitoring and enforcement. A lot of the remedies have about a 5 to 7 year time frame where they have to be implemented and where we have to monitor them. So particular obligations on these firms to say, once a year, you have to supply us with a report on progress. But there's also powers where we can say, okay, so 6 months have gone past. I want to understand what your progress is. Give me your documents. Give me your information. I want to understand how this is coming along. I think that links with what I just said about, you know, this caught no one by surprise. No one was surprised when we told them you have to enter into agreements with small agencies, with black agencies to train them. You know, they knew that was coming from the start. So I think that's the first point. I think to confirm as well that this is not a situation where we are done now, we're walking away, we're going on with other work. The Commission is going to stay with this inquiry for at least the next 5 years, actively stay involved in our recommendations, in our remedies. That's the time that we set aside for ourselves to monitor and enforce these remedies. Of course, it's going to be a lot longer, I think, because some of these remedies are going to take some time. The second one is, and I think this is perhaps where a larger concern is about, given the sort of track record of the Department of Agriculture in particular, but maybe government as a whole and government efficiency as a whole, is can government just walk away? Can government put this on a shelf and walk away? And I think here's the complexities of a democracy is coming in, and it gets quite legalistic. The bottom line is that neither the Commission nor the Competition Act has the powers to force government to do anything. And here the argument is, and the law is in fact, that that's Parliament's job. So the only body in this democracy that can tell the executive what they must and mustn't do is Parliament in terms of acts of Parliament, in terms of law. The Commission can't override that system to say, okay, we are going to force the Department of Agriculture to do X, Y, Z. So we have to coach the remedies we want government to do. We have to coach them as recommendations. Now, technically, they're non-binding. So technically, it's not a situation where we say we're forcing you to do anything. But the Act has certain checks and balances built into it. So, for example, we have, and this report, by the way, has already been tabled in Parliament. So it's part of the parliamentary agenda, where now the report has to go to the portfolio committees where it gets discussed, it gets debated by the different political parties. We are involved in that process as well, where we say, okay, now it becomes part of policy formation. So when we talk about making policy, creating laws that implement that policy, you have to do it on the basis of this report. So that's a much longer time frame. It is indirect. It's not something, of course, that any person on the ground says, okay, well, that's immediate impact. But that's just the way democracy works. That's just the way our legal system works. So, I wish I could have said to anyone asking me this question that, no, we forced the government to do this because we know what has to be done and we know the solutions. they have to now agree with this. But similar to the private sector firms, we had many meetings and engagements with our government partners, with the different divisions in government. This wasn't a surprise for them. In fact, a lot of the remedies has come from the Department of Agriculture themselves. So, for example, Department of Agriculture saying, look, in terms of the Constitution, we don't have authorities as the national department. We don't have authority over the municipal fresh produce markets, because that's a competency that, in terms of the Constitution, resides with local governments. So as much as we want to intervene in fixing these NFPMs, we can't, because the Constitution doesn't give us those powers. So we as the Department of Agriculture, we want to review all the legislation that pertains to that, and maybe get more involved. And if it comes to a constitutional change, well, that's something we consider. So we gave them that remedy, and we say we actually recommend that they, as the Department of Agriculture, has a complete review of all the legislation, including the Constitution, if that's what they want to do, to review that legislation and take it through Parliament and change what they want to change. So again, that's something that comes from the department themselves. It's not something that we enforcing on them, and it's coming as a surprise to them. A lot of these things was designed, was come up in a way that, it in discussion with government. So there's really no reason for them to say, look, we don't like this and we're just going to ignore this because we don't agree with this. I mean, before we published the report, before we made these final findings and remedies, we had these conversations, and that goes with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and the Department of Water and Sanitation. So these things are not a surprise to them. These things aren't unfamiliar with them. These are things that link with their current program. So, for example, in the DTIC, they already have a fund established. The money is there. We just said, okay, link that funding to sponsoring or assisting new entrants in shopping malls, the greengrocer model I refer to. Link it to those new entrants so they can get that assistance, because the money is there, the programs are there. And that came about in the discussions with the DTIC. So I think a multi-leveled question there, that some of the findings are binding, some of the recommendations are non-binding, although it forms part of policy creation, part of the creation of laws. And then thirdly, saying the Commission isn't just going to walk away. The Commission isn't saying we are going to walk away from this ourselves and let our reports gather dust, at least for the next couple of years. It has to be, we are going to be very involved in monitoring and in compliance. So, Livson, in terms of your question, so I think I'm going to start with the second question about how do farmers sort of, enter into NFPMs, particularly relative to the large farmers. And I think it was one of the complexities, in fact, about understanding how these NFPMs work. If you look at the sort of technical barriers to entry, there are almost none. Any farmer in the country can go to an NFPM, any NFPM for that matter, and sell their goods, right? There's nothing that says it has to be a minimum volume, it has to be a certain this, a certain that. The quality standards that was referred to earlier is, again, mandated by law. And that's so that we don't poison consumers, that we don't give them bad produce, that we don't charge them for produce that is not what it says it is. If you label your produce as a grade 1, you get a grade 1 price, but the consumer gets a grade 2. That's, of course, unfair. So the requirements that are there, the quality control standards that are there, particularly with PROCON, the government sort of quality controller at the NFPMs, it's really to protect consumers as well, even though it makes it a bit more expensive, a bit more difficult for farmers. We know it serves a valid purpose. Again, so technically, there's no barrier that says, no farmer, or you have to be a certain size or that sort of thing. Any farmer can go into. In practice, though, we observe that isn't what happens, right? So small farmers have this reluctance to go through the NFPMs. And it really has to do with a knowledge gap, is that they don't understand. It has to do with a relationship gap. They don't trust the agent. They don't want to, hand over this produce that they've spent a lot of money on, spend a lot of time on, harvested now. They don't want to give that to someone else, and then a couple of days later find out that the price isn't what they want. But that's a relationship problem. That's something that is only really solvable through advocacy means, through through educational means, through this farmers building those relationships. So some of the agencies do that. Some of the agencies go out to the rural farms and the rural places. They make that connection with small farmers, emerging farmers, build that relationship. That's something that's going to take time. That's something it takes sort of from both parties. They have to get together. The measures we have in this report is exactly aimed at sort of facilitating that. We're not going to force parties to do business with each other, but we are saying we can create a level playing field. We can make it easier for a farmer to enter because the facilities are cleaner, the facilities are more efficient. They understand more about what the process is, and then also the sort of environment for creating those relationships exist. So again, not a straightforward answer there, but I think it's really important for for us to understand that we're not going to force people to do anything they don't want to. It has to come from both parties as well, as long as we can create a level playing field. Then I think, Livson, on your other question about government getting involved, maybe it links to my first answer as well, is that sort of government is already involved, and government itself wants more sales through the NFPMs. I mean, remember also that these NFPMs generate revenue for the municipalities. They get about 5% of all sales that go through their floors gets allocated to the municipalities, and they pay for for the operating and their capital expenditure through that. And that's quite different. I mean, if you look at the building of roads, electricity, water, libraries, clinics, very few of them generate the sort of revenue that these municipal markets generate. And yet the municipal markets is an afterthought for most of these municipalities. And that's why we say, well, change the operating model, get them out of the system where they have to compete for the demands of electricity and water and sewerage and clinics and libraries and schools and all these sort of things. Make them a business unit so they can operate almost independently with their own board, with their own budgets, with their own procurement lines, and they're not actually competing for the attention with the rest of the local government service delivery issues. And the second is ring fence their profits so that their profits doesn't get absorbed and gets allocated to the building of libraries or anything, because all of these are competing interests and all of them are equally important. You can't say it's not important to have functioning clinics and functioning libraries and roads and that sort of thing. And that's again where it gets difficult. So we say, no, take it out of this, ring fence the profits, give them access to the money that they make, particularly the profits that they make, and then they can reinvest in themselves. They can actually increase their own efficiencies. And then also the obligations from market agents themselves to say, look, we have to train our fellow agents. We have to, try and transfer some of the skills we have. So government is already involved, and it's through the different spheres. You will find that national government and provincial governments are more involved in the production side, so with farmers, and then your local governments are involved in the sort of selling side, the wholesale side, the NFPM side. Right, so moving on to Nazir's question. So some good questions, Nazir. I think it's important that we that we address those. I think some good insights there. So your first question on how do the agents impact on pricing, and I think it's critical, and it's why we had such a huge focus on the agents, because the agents are absolutely central to price formation. So even though they are only an intermediary, like an estate agent selling a house, it's not their own house they're selling it on someone's behalf. It's the same with the agents. They're not buying from you and selling it on to someone else. They're just acting as the intermediary. When a buyer comes and says, I want X tons of potatoes, the agent says, well, I have X ton, let's talk about the price. So the agents act as the intermediary, but because they are the intermediary, they are absolutely central to price formation. They are really the ones that are determining the price. And of course, it's negotiations. Of course, it's supply and demand. Of course, it depends on seasonality. It depends on what is available. So if the floor is packed from floor to the rafters with potatoes, there's an oversupply, the prices are going to drop. Similarly, if there's a shortage of supply, the prices are going to increase. And the agents really play a critical role there, because they really are the specialists when it comes to what is in supply, what is the demand, How many buyers do I have? How many farmers do I have? To a point where they can call a farmer and say, look, the market is flushed with tomatoes, for example. Hold off on your harvest. Give me 2 weeks. You know, if you can store your harvest with 2 weeks, let the supply just go down a bit. Let's increase the demand, and then the prices will go up. So they really play that role. It's a central and a critical role that the agents play. And you know, and that's why there has to be quite strict regulation from both their own regulator, the Agricultural Produce Agents Council, APAC, that regulates their conduct, make sure they have a fidelity fund certificate, their books are in order, they're not stealing, they're not doing other conduct that's irregular. But also us as a competition regulator to say when it comes to price formation, there are certain things that they should not be doing. But absolutely, they are central to price formation and the negotiating between farmer and buyer. Your second question about the retailers, how do the retailers impact price? So I think it's really what we say, it's mostly one-sided. So the retailers don't impact the pricing that's charged at the NFPMs. It's the other way around, right? So the prices that happens at NFPMs happen independently of the retailers. You know, that's, like I just said, that's supply and demand. That's what's coming in from the farmers. That's how many buyers are there, that sort of supply and demand. But what happens is when the retailers are negotiating directly with the farmer, they look at the prices that is being obtained at the NFPMs because the farmer can walk away. So if they make an offer that's far lower than what is obtainable at the NFPM, the farmer can walk away because there's no exclusivity agreements. There's no agreement with the farmer that locks the farmer into that retailer and says, you can only supply to me. None of that exists. So the farmer is free to walk away and sell the same produce that is available to the retailer, sell that at NFPM. So the retailers then have to look at the pricing that is obtainable at the NFPMs and really make their pricing more or less relevant to that. What we found with the actual pricing is that the actual pricing is higher. The retailers pay more to the farmer than what the farmer would have obtained at the NFPMs. In most instances, in sort of general terms, that's what happens. So it's not a situation where the retailers are exploiting the farmers. And that was our big concern, is we're saying these retailers are big, they're massive companies, multi-billion dollar million rand companies here. They're so powerful. Are they actually exploiting the farmers? And what we resoundingly find is that they're not. The evidence is showing us that they're not. I mentioned there's no exclusivity agreements. There's no minimum supply commitment. So, for example, what would happen there is a retailer would say, if you don't supply me with this many volumes by this date, I'm going to penalize you and lower your price. There's none of that happening. And then also there's favorable terms. So if you're a smaller farmer, you get better repayment terms. So you get paid quicker, you get a better price, you get less rebates. Most of the terms are rebates is what you pay back to the farmer, it really gets deducted from your price. Less gets deducted from the smaller farmer. So it's not even that our smallest farmers are getting exploited because they're small. The retailers are actually treating them quite well. And that was a big concern for us, is that the retailers are exploiting the farmers. That's not happening. But to your question, Nazir, it's actually the retailers are looking at what is happening at the NFPMs. The NFPMs have very little concern with what is happening with the retailers. That's separate. That's a very different supply chain. And then your final question, Nazir, is about the price for small farmers, is how do we get them to sort of get better prices at NFPMs? It's a really tricky question here because what we are saying on the one hand is that these NFPMs, the way that they are functioning, this commission-based system, the supply and demand system, on proviso that the agents don't do anything that they shouldn't do, that they are being honest traders, that it's a good system, that it's a system that works, it's a system that disciplines the rest of the value chain, it's a system that keeps everything in check. If not for the NFPMs, it would have been disaster in terms of food security, food safety, and then pricing. It would have been a disaster. The picture would have been a lot different. And I know a farmer will always say, I don't like the price, it's too little. Of course, the buyer says the exact opposite. The price is too high. I want to get the prices as low as possible. The farmer says the price must be as high as possible. And that's where the markets come in. The NFPM comes and balances out those two. And it's a critical balancing role that the NFPMs plays. Part of the reason that we say they have to be protected. They are absolutely critical. We can't afford them to go down the drain. So we can't really intervene in a sense where we say, okay, so preferential pricing to SME farmers. If they come, give them 10% more than what the current price is. That would really just upset that balance, and that would lead to likely more unintended consequences and really just disrupt too much. So instead, what we think should happen is farmers should really work together. They should really collaborate. So when the farmers collaborate, and we saw this on the ground, we went to, for example, the Mapani's Farmers Association, very well organized association of farmers, rural farmers, all of them small farmers, majority, by the way, black women farmers, coming together and saying, okay, so let's talk about what we can supply. Let's talk about the sort of price we want. Let's bundle the transport so that we all harvest more or less the same. Let's not all plant the same things, right? Because then there's just a huge supply of green beans, for example, because everyone planted green beans because last year the green bean prices were high. Now there's an oversupply, the pricing drops, and then these farmers suffer a loss. So that's really where it comes into, is that, and in a more sort of formal way than just your standard cooperatives. And I know government has sort of been forcing cooperative on farmers. It hasn't really worked. This has to be a voluntary cooperative where farmers get together and say, okay, look, we need to work together. We need to talk to each other about what we're going to plant, the prices we're going to get. Are we going to share some of the cost? Are we going to buy the fertilizer in bulk and we get a better price? Are we going to bundle the transport costs, the packaging costs? You know, are we going to sort of share that amongst each other and then also share the revenue, share the profits that we make? And I think that really is the way forward. There are block exemptions. So some would say, but aren't these farmers competitors? Should they be getting together and be, you know, agreeing on a fixed price? Normally, that would have been a contravention of the Competition Act. But we recognize the need for this. So we said there's a block exemption. There's a sort of blanket exemption for SMEs, and that also applies to SME farmers, to small and emerging farmers, to say, well, let's get together. There is just a bit of formalities, but that's where you come to us if you want to know that the Commission is supervising that and is involved in those processes. But the principle here is that we want the farmers to actually come together, to cooperate. That's what happened, you know, pre-1994, is the large farmers, when they were still small, when they were still growing, that's the exact same model that they used. And it's the model that got them to where they are today. It's a model that can still work. Not forced cooperative as such, because then there's no shared interest. And then the cooperative is failing and has been failing, as we see. Rather, these must be voluntary cooperatives or similar structures that they get together, they bundle demand, they bundle supply, they bundle cost, and they share profits. So that's a model, and it's a lot easier, I know, than it sounds. But that's, I think, one of the solutions that can solve some of the problems that the farmers are facing when they take their produce to an agent, and either the volume is too small, they're not getting the price, they're feeling exposed, there's a lack of communication, that sort of thing. When that agent is dealing with an association or with a cooperative, for example, and there's a contact point, and there's that sort of back and forth, it mirrors the relationship that agency has with the more the larger farmer, the so-called more sophisticated farmer that has teams of people that deals with the agencies. Right. So, Rina, I think I've sort of answered some of the questions as well. I mean, I think just a confirmation really that, the Commission is still heavily involved in discussions with our government partners. It's not a sort of one-sided, this is what you do, we look the other way and we walk away. So, for example, we've already written to the ministers, our minister, the DTIC minister has written to his counterparts, both in the Department of Cooperative Governance, because here we're dealing with the different spheres of government, national, provincial, and local. So there's cooperation needed between those two. So we're getting the Department of Cooperative Governance involved. And then, of course, the Department of Agriculture is already quite involved with creating the remedies. So we gave them what they wanted for. But those are ongoing discussions. So even though we can't technically force them, we can have discussions, we can help them assist, and those are ongoing. So we created those relationships during the inquiry, and we're creating with this. We have our contact people with the different departments, and that relationship is extending. Right. So finally, on blended finance. So interesting question here. So what we believe is it's going to be favorable terms, because that's sort of the whole idea behind the blended finance scheme as well, is that, the commercial banks have all bought into this because it's not for them a sense where they can sort of make money off these farmers in the same way that you can on sort of normal commercial loans. The benefit for the commercial banks is that the risk is removed, because government is either guaranteeing some of the money, or they, in the form of grants, paying a certain percentage if there is a default or whatever. So the risk is removed for the commercial banks, and because that risk is removed, they're saying, look, we can just make money in the ordinary course. We don't have to have these high interest rates. But it is something that's far more complex than that, of course, Rina, and I think you know about this. It is, there always has to be something in the for it in the commercial banks, or they are going to walk away. We initially thought the answer would be the land bank, because that is a development bank. It's a bank that is tailor-made for this. But we know as well from history, anyone that's dealt with the land bank, they tried this, almost overcompensated on the development side, and they went bankrupt. Right, so all of their guarantees were called up, all their own loans were called up, and they needed to be bailed out by government. So for the land bank themselves, they need to strike a balance between commercial terms and developmental terms. And they're only really now coming, after about 4 years, they're only really now coming back into the development side. Really only been giving loans to the commercial farmers, the large farmers that they know can repay the loans, but they have to sort of, again, do more on the development side. And that's where we come in and we say, well, your role can then be on the blended finance scheme, either in then also granting the loan or the grant portion or the guarantee portion, or then standing in for the entire rest of the portion where Department of Agriculture then gives the guarantee. So yeah, I think, listen, that's it from my side. Happy to hear from the other panelists, or if there's more questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Rowan. I had asked that we extend the time a bit. I want to take more questions. Apologies, Nolo, Tebuho, and Sisbongile, but I want to bring in more voices. There's 2 hands that have been up for the duration of this discussion, so I want to bring them in, and then maybe Nolo and Tebuho and others can respond. Oscar, I will come to you, and then immediately after, Sharon, please come in with your question. Those are the only 2 hands that I'm seeing. After those 2 hands, I'm going to then hand over to Tebuho, Nolo, Sbongile, Ruan to respond and do your final remarks as well, and then we will close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandisa. And thank you for the intellectual and I have 2 questions. Sorry. Thank you for the presentations. They were quite nourishing intellectually. The first question is directed to the first speaker, which is Tebuho. Tebuho, you mentioned that the informal sector, which is informal trade, is often regarded as erratic, unpredictable, which makes them an unreliable market. So I wanted to find out, on what ground or basis are you referring to that? Meaning that in as far as what I've recently learned is that research conducted in a fresh produce market, it has found that in Joburg market, these informal traders, They have contributed consistently to the market turnover, and they've also created a demand for fresh produce, particularly vegetables, from both small-scale farmers and commercial farmers. The second question goes to Sibongile, which is related to the fresh produce market. That do they have any systems in place to integrate black farmers, particularly the newly entrant farmers? So the third one is just a comment to Ruan. Thank you very much for mentioning the intersection between the municipal markets, food security, and food safety, which touches or speaks to the fourth dimension of food security, which is stability, as you also mentioned, and access. You mentioned that we saw that these markets continued to operate during COVID-19, which speaks to resilience of the value chain, the markets as an important node in the value chain. But one thing that I wanted to touch on was that the value chain approach, I feel like it limits us from understanding the power dimension within the fresh produce value chain and the inequities, the racialized inequities within the agent system of the market. So my proposition to you, Ruan, is that it could be wise and nice to integrate or use the food system framework, as it allows us to look at this power dimension and power structures to say who are the winners in this system and who are the losers in this system. And by so doing, we'll understand the fresh produce or vegetable value chain as a subsystem within the food system that fits into the core, which is the food value chain. And thank you very much for that.
Sharon, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Mandisa. It's around here, ne? Okay, first of all, I would say thank you so much to all the speakers. But then I've got plus minus 10 questions, but then I think I will take 2 or 3. And then Ruan, I think okay, Mandisa, first of all, I think this session we need it. Yeah, we need it. It's serious and we need it. It affects us as small scale farmers. And then going to Ruan, I think let me first start by saying in your presentation, there's nothing much about climate change, which is sometimes something that really affects smallholder farmers who do not have even funding to support their products. And then going again to Ruan, how do you small-scale farmers get involved in the inquiry? And how do you select those that are participating in the inquiry? And then the issue of, in your slide, NFPMI outcomes. I don't think it's true that small-scale farmers get fair price from the market. It's not true, according to the problems that are according to the challenges that are affecting us as small-scale farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It looks like a big number of questions are directed to you, Ruan. So I'll give you a chance to respond again. And then, Ms. Bongile, there was a question for you as well.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Oscar. I think your point is well made that, you know, the sort of food system framework, which is the holistic approach, is a better a better approach to understanding the dynamics. I think the purpose of that slide was really just a very simplified approach. A point I wanted to make there was really just to make a distinction between the NFPM value chain and the sort of direct supply chain. And I think that comes from our understanding initially that there's really one supply chain for fresh produce, and that when retailers are buying from farmers, it's actually endangering the livelihoods or the viability of the NFPMs. And that was the sort of starting point, is that the more the retailers are contracting with farmers, the less produce there is available for the NFPMs. That was the sort of starting hypothesis. And I think our finding at the end was that's not the dynamic. So in fact, it's two distinct, two separate supply chains. In fact, some of the markets are telling us that, if the retailers had to put back their demand on the NFPMs, and that produce has to go through the NFPMs, there's no way that the NFPMs could handle that kind of volume. So the whole system would collapse. So, it's not a situation of just bring back the produce and you're increasing the volumes. Those markets, just their facilities aren't capable of handling that kind of additional volume. So it's two distinct supply chains, but there are interactions. There are sort of, back and forth between those supply chains. But very correct, Oscar, if you want to understand where the power dynamics are, you need to look at it a bit more holistic. And I think our report in the main does that. Really, that sort of focused approach, that simplified approach was really just for the presentation. Right, so I think the question on climate change is, of course, I think we did mention that in our terms of reference, and we wanted to spend some time on climate change and understanding that impact. When we went to visit small-scale farmers, we asked them the questions about climate change, and there's no doubt in our minds that climate change is a huge problem. I think the question for us, though, is what are the competition dynamics around climate change? And I think the answer there is that climate change is a much bigger and a much more complicated problem than just for a competition regulator. So it affects competition in the sense where it weakens the position of one of the critical players being producers or farmers. It makes supply uncertain, that affects pricing. But I think that's more of an indirect problem here for the regulator. If we really want to fix climate change, it has to be a broader governmental approach. So we acknowledged in the main report, we acknowledged the problems of climate change. We acknowledge the fact that farmers are saying this is a huge problem, but it's not something that a competition regulator can solve. Definitely not on its own. So, but a very apt comment there. Climate change is a huge problem. Always say we as consumers don't notice this. You don't see it, because you go into a store, whether it's formal or informal, you go there, the produce is there. You don't know that that's actually, half of it was destroyed by erratic rains or by hailstorms that have never happened in that area, that sort of thing. So climate change is something that affects farmers directly. It's something that you ask any farmer in this country, they will tell you it's a big problem. The question, of course, and it's a question the entire world is grappling with, is what are the solutions to climate change? And I don't think South Africa has moved the dial at all when it comes to even really acknowledging the problem and the extent of the problem, let alone trying to fix that problem. So a very apt comment there. So how do farmers get involved in the inquiry, particularly small-scale farmers? So technically the inquiry is done with the publication of the final report. So we are now in the monitoring and the implementation phase of the inquiry. So you get involved by just reaching out. So there's a lot of advocacy work that remains. There's a lot of sort of additional interactions, stakeholder interactions that we need and we want. So you get involved by just contacting us, and you can contact me. I'll leave my details with Mandisa and anyone at CRED as well. Is that we get involved, and we want to hear from you as well. There are certain additional work, certain additional scoping that is underway. Maybe for that enforcement action I mentioned at the start against particular firms. We're done with the broad understanding, the broad view. Now we know, particularly on the market agent side, where we need to focus on the individual firms. So yeah, I note the comment about pricing, and as I said, it's always difficult for the individuals. Any farmer will say, I'm not getting fair pricing. The buyer will say, I'm not getting fair pricing. So we took a step back and we looked at the balance. We looked at an incredible amount of data directly, and it is a very complex question that about whether the price that has happened, the price that is determined by sort of normal supply and demand dynamics, whether that price, which protects food security, which protects food safety, which protects competition, is a fair price to the small scale farmers. And then what do you do if we say it's not? Do you then impose sort of price regulation to say to markets, to say to buyers that you have to pay more because this is a small scale farmer? And if we do that, what are the sort of unintended consequences? So I think a very complex question, but I think the comment is noted, and I think it's a fair comment from the perspective of a small scale farmer. Thanks, Mandisa.
Thanks, Ruan. Sisbongile, please come in. After Sisbongile, Lihlonolo and Tebuho, please, can I have your closing remarks?
Thank you so much, Mandisa, and thank you to the colleagues. My answer will be to Oscar regarding the integration of farmers at the Joburg Fresh Produce Market. So at the Joburg Fresh Produce Market, like it was indicated earlier on, as a farmer, you're allowed to come in. And the challenge that we have actually seen with most of our farmers will be on the packaging side, where when you bring your produce, it has to be packaged a certain way. And also the food and safety standards need to be met, especially on sorting of your produce and all that. So those are the other things that we are looking at as Green Tree Agency, to say we'll provide training to our producers that as you come in, you log in to be a supplier as a producer. We'll be giving you trainings on how to do your packaging and how you are going to be assisted in getting your produce food safe, and actually having the right trainings on how to actually meet the standards. Because fresh produce market, it's not only selling to the locals, there's also export produce that is going out. And also on the side of informal traders, you raised an important question regarding informal traders, because those are the biggest buyers at the city of Deep here at the Joburg market. They come in and they buy not only for local selling, they also sell to our neighboring countries. So at the Joburg market, informal trade is actually the one behind also the buying of produce here on a daily basis. So they are the major contributors when it comes to buying of produce. And it also exposes you to other countries. As a farmer, you are able to be sending your produce. Like currently we're in engagements with Maputo, where they're looking for producers who will supply them with onion and potatoes. So there's a big demand for onion and potatoes as well in Maputo. So the exposure for producers is quite high. And then also you mentioned the effect of the change of the food system, because like you said, some of the value chain challenges would be the cost that is too high for the producer at the early stage, because as you bring in your produce to the Joburg market, the cost of production is your cost. The cost of packaging is also your cost. So those are the major challenges that we face as farmers, because I'm speaking it as an agency, but I'm wearing a cap as a farmer, because when we bring in your produce, there's a cost that needs to be added. And then there's also another cost of transport, because if you bring in your produce to the Joburg market, there's a transport cost that is a cost to the producer. And that's why it goes back to the question that was raised by Uraundi, saying there are no preferential pricing for farmers, and the cost most of the time is too high for the farmer, because the regulation of the pricing as well here at the Joburg market is regulated by supply and demand, and the prices are fixed on a daily basis. So you don't have a fixed price as compared to when you are selling to other buyers who will say, bring me cabbage at 20 rand and you get that price. But at the Joburg market, on a daily basis, the price changes, and you cannot say you coming today and yesterday the price was 20 rand, and you come in today, you find that it's actually gone down to 15 rands. So the price, it's not preferential and not fixed. And it's another challenge that we find that there's a challenge for producers. That when you bring your produce, there's that question of, am I getting the best price? And it takes us back to the retailers, because retailers also, they put in a markup just as much as at the Joburg market, there's a municipal percentage that is 5%, then there's an agency fee of 3%. And then when you're sending it to the retailers, they also have overheads that they have to pay for. So they charge you a percentage, especially when you're looking at your retail shops where you are given shelf space. You also have a portion that is held back to cover the cost of keeping your produce at the shelf space. But now with some of the engagements, because we are not only looking at the fresh produce market, we're also looking at markets outside the country where we are able to negotiate price with the buyers. Then it alleviates the challenges of saying you are squeezed on price as a producer, because now you are told to say there's a fixed price on a daily basis. So you are able to expose you to other markets outside the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibongile. Lehloanolo, please, can I have your closing remarks? Then Tebogo after you, and then we hand over to you, Levson, for next steps.
Thank you, Mandisa. And thank you to everyone on the call and all the speakers for very insightful engagement. So on my side, I think that, you know, because of might be my bias, because I work for an organization that is particularly focusing only on women and women entrepreneurs. But I do think that women are not asking for favors or special treatment. I think they are demanding, you know, their rightful place in the economy. You know, they are feeding nations, they are creating jobs, they are driving economic growth. But we tend to continue to see the, you know, systemic barriers that continue to exclude them from really participating fully within the markets. I do think that the Competition Commission's Fish Produce Market Inquiry has been a really key, and it has really highlighted critical reforms. But I do think that we really need to look at applying a gender lens, you know, into the interventions that seek to promote, you know, and dismantle the market entry barriers. Otherwise, we do risk reinforcing the inequalities that continue to, you know, exacerbate the barriers into market entry. Market entry is not really just an economic participation. I think it's about ensuring that there's fairness, there's justice, and that women really, there is value for them to participate and trade within the industry. And we must look beyond just the broad, you know, small, medium enterprises policies, but we need to ensure that the fresh produce markets actively promote space for women entrepreneurs. And this means that we need to look at prioritizing direct procurement for women farmers and traders, and to ensure that we break the cycle of exclusion, and that financial institutions really also look at tailoring financial products and market incentives that really recognizes the unique challenges that women are facing. And I think we really need to push for that, especially as advocacy organizations, to work together with institutions to ensure that there is gender lens investing for women, and also ensuring that we support women in terms of, you know, being compliant and ensuring that there are no gatekeeping tools that keep them out of the markets. But yeah, I think those are my parting words. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. and to all the women entrepreneurs and all the farmers, and not just women, that are really, helping the country and the continent in terms of addressing the food insecurity in the world. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nolo. Deborah, please come in with your closing remarks.
Sure, thanks. I think there's actually one question that was directed to me, which I'll quickly respond to, and also then share my parting comments. I think it was a question around the supply to the informal market in terms of the demand, where we say the demand tends to be quite unpredictable. I think when we're saying that, we're referring to direct sales to the informal market. Of course, there is sale to the informal market that happens through the fresh produce markets, like the other speakers have spoken about, the informal traders that buy from the fresh produce market. But I think what we're referring to, at least in terms of what I was talking about, is direct sales to the informal markets, to say that demand in that regard tend to be quite unpredictable, and it tend to be quite uncoordinated and fragmented. And of course, that means that there's limitations in terms of the ability of farmers to sell large scale produce, right? There's limitation in terms of how much they can be able to sell at any given point in time, given, of course, the perishability of the fresh produce market as well as the running costs. I think that's just what I wanted to clarify. I think the point that I also want to touch on is around the issue of funding and the blended finance that we're speaking about. I'm wondering if the commission went further beyond, of course, the statement and what's stated from government and other stakeholders, that there's this blended finance. Because I think that interventions in this regard, in most cases, stop at the stage of where they're supposed to scrutinize the activities of the partners to this blended finance, your financial institution, your commercial banks, as well as your development finance institutions, your IDCs, your land banks. Because this wouldn't be new, at least from the research that we have done also previously in the development finance landscape, in particular looking at some of the blended finance instruments, such as the Black Industrialist Scheme, which is a blended finance instrument, right? But there are challenges in that regard in terms of the challenges with accessing the component that has to come from the commercial banks, as well as the development finance, and in particular your IDC and your land bank, because essentially they operate like commercial banks, right? In as much as, of course, the objectives are to be developmental, but in practice, that has not been the case. And at least from what we've gathered is that there's no distinction between applications that come or go through some of these developmental or blended finance scheme. For instance, applications that go through the Black Industrialist Scheme, they go through the same processes and the same selection criteria as all the other applications that go through the normal funding that your IDC and your other financial institutions do, right? And of course, the blended part of it is important in that it reduces the risk, it de-risks the project in essence, as Ruan has referred to. But I think we have not scrutinized in terms of the practicality of what happens on the ground in terms of assessment of applications that come through such programs. And I think that's where the bottlenecks are. That's why you find that they exist, because you also have the Enquiry fund, which is also a blended finance, right? They exist, but small scale holders or small scale producers continue to face challenges accessing them. And when you look deeper into that, you see that the challenges lie with the partners to the blending, the financial institutions, the development finance institutions. I'm highlighting also the development finance institutions because we tend to believe that they are developmental in practice, but you find that in practice they are not. They operate more like commercial banks, and in some instances even more stringent than commercial banks, and even the interest rates that they charge, if you speak to to those that have acquired funding from them is that the interest rates, they tend to be even higher than what you would get from the commercial banks. So I think, because I think that's also the limitation with the policy interventions such as your agriculture and agro-processing master plan, where it implicitly assumes that blended finance in the form of a partnership with your DFIs, partnership with commercial banks will yield increased access to finance. But that has not been the case, because I think we have not scrutinized more about the lending activities of the commercial banks, the lending activities of the development financial institutions, in terms of the criteria that they put in place. How do we make it to be more accessible? Of course, still ensuring that the due diligence processes are in place so that you don't bankrupt them, so that they don't fall into financial problems. So I think that that's just an issue that I wanted to sort of highlight, to say how in this of course, I know the commission, there are going to be other market inquiries in other sectors. Perhaps it's some issue that they may want to look much deeper into, if it was not the case in this current market inquiry, to say, can you go beyond what we are told in terms of programs that are in place, to say, for instance, it would be interesting to understand from the development financial institutions and commercial banks, to say, how do you assess applications that come through the blended finance vis-a-vis those that come through through the normal standard loans that you offer? Because my suspicion is that the criteria remains the same. There's nothing that changes. Hence why you find that when you speak to those that have gone through the process, they tell you that it remains very stringent and very difficult to access that funding, even as on paper and in the media and everywhere, farmers and small-scale producers are told that there are these facilities available, but access there too becomes a challenge. I think that those would be my parting shots. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Debuho. I'll hand over to Livsin, and he's going to do next step and close for us. Thank you, Livsin. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mandisa. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Just in closing, I think this has been a really informative session and discussion, one of many to come. We've started a series of these webinars to really, get to the crux of some of these developments and create, a platform for sharing information and bringing in, experts and different, colleagues with different expertise and knowledge and information that they can simplify and share with our, constituencies, our stakeholders, including small scale farmers. Just a few things to mention from my side in terms of, what is to discuss in the next steps and way forward. I think, this information is really valuable. But one thing that we should think of is, how can we spread awareness further than this of stakeholders here. So we do have the Just Agriculture Transition movement that we started a few months back. I think we can start to use that as a platform to share the information. But also, again, as one said, this report is dense, 400 plus pages of information. Okay. So how can we start, to synthesize some of this information, simplify it, Teboko and Nolo and team, simplify it into small fact sheets, some of them translated into local languages, to be able to raise awareness and share this information with stakeholders. And this requires us to go beyond, the webinars and get into communities and organize farmers around here, your team that side, organize farmers and be able to access them and bring this to them and have these discussions on an ongoing basis. So, raising awareness and strengthening information sharing and simplifying these documents. There was also another conversation around capacity building. I think, as we share information, we to develop skills and capacitate, SMEs and small scale farmers in terms of the, compliance requirements, conditions for their involvement, access to finance. So we need also to have a different package that we develop that can allow us to get into those spaces with credible information and contacts where they can also be, where they can access support and capacity development. There was another conversation that Rowan put on the table around how can farmers cooperate between and among themselves to be able to access these markets as an organized sector and be able to bargain and bring in, their produce, with with a bit of power, so organizing and being able to come together and accessing and cooperating and building relationships at their level and being able to access, these markets as a block. And then I think there is a really huge advocacy and influencing angle that comes out. So how can we organize small farmers? How can we organize in the movement to be able to directly engage with government, the commission, and other players in the sector, including making submissions and contributions to the parliamentary portfolio committees discussing these reports, so that the views and the sentiments from the ground, from these stakeholders, are taken into account and incorporated in those discussions. So I think from us as Oxfam and from the partnership we have within the Fair for All, the Fair for All group, I think consortium group, I think it is really around how can we facilitate and be catalysts to this awareness raising process, this capacity building process, relationship building in cooperation between farmers, as well as advocacy and influencing aspects of the work that needs to continue. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating in this conversation, and to say that this is one of many. And Ruan, I think, and all the colleagues involved, I think there is a space for us to engage some more and find avenues, for us to continue, engaging our stakeholders and sharing this information beyond this platform that we have. So thank you everybody for participating. And as Oxfam, we always look forward to hearing your views and taking those views into account as we develop specific positions, that will be critical in influencing, the policy discussions going forward. So thank you, and have a blessed and restful weekend and a good Friday. Cheers.
Cheers, colleagues. Thank you so much. We will be in contact with the next webinar or event. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Ciao. Cheers, everybody.
Sure, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
everyone.
Mandisa. Thank you, Lison.
Thank you so
Polo.
much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.